Hi there, esteemed audience, and welcome to another episode of Middle Grade Ninja. I'm Rob Kent, but don't skip. I know some of you savvy, esteemed audience members go ahead and skip ahead because you know I'm going to talk for a couple of minutes about my books, and you just get to the great content, get to MG Hennessey. I understand. That's your reward for being a regular listener or viewer. But you might want to stay tuned because I'm about to announce an exciting contest. The show is available on Spotify, Stitcher, iTunes, all the standard podcast places. But you can also watch us live on YouTube. If you haven't checked out the show on YouTube, check it out. The channel is just Rob Kent, or do a search for Middle Grade Ninja. We're going to come right up. I've been doing a lot of work on YouTube this past week. Been breaking down the longer episodes into short, easy to digest clips. So, if you're thinking, man, Lamar Giles made such a great point, but I don't know if I want to listen to that whole 2-hour podcast I got you covered. It's going to be broken down into a 5 or 10 minute clip. So check out Rob Kent at YouTube and subscribe. It's free. You'll get updated next time the podcast goes live. You'll be able to watch us live. And if you subscribe between now and let's see, it's July 10th. Nobody likes math. So let's just say from now to August 15th, we'll call that a month. To August 15th, if you subscribe to my channel, Rob Kent, I've got nice free copies of Something Like Gravity by previous guest Amber Smith and the Echo Park Castaways by tonight's guest, MG Hennessey. What a deal. That's like $40, $50. I don't math so well, but it's a lot of money in books that I'm just going to give you for free because they sent me ARCs. My ARC is all beat up and marked with notes. I'm keeping that one. But this nice pristine copy, this can be sent to you. And if you act now, I will throw in a copy of any one of my books. Your choice. You pick one of my books. I will sign it for you. I will send it along with the Echo Park Castaways and Something Like Gravity. The only thing you have to do is between now and August 15th, go to YouTube, to Rob Kent, and subscribe. Smash the subscribe button. It's free. It helps me grow the viewership and helps me promote authors. Why wouldn't you want to help something like that? It'll be amazing. And I hear what you're saying. Rob, I might subscribe, but not get a free book. Well, that's where you're wrong, friend, because my book, Banneker Bones and the Giant Robot Bees, is available to download free as an audiobook. As an ebook right this moment. It's also available as an audiobook. If you've got Audible, you could use a credit, then it's free. Otherwise, you got to pay some money, but it's worth it. It's so good. And then, of course, Banneker Bones and the Alligator People is also available. If you say, Rob, I like the show Middle Grade Ninja, but I'm not that much of a middle grade fan, I got you covered. Under the super secret pen name Robert Kent, I write horror novels, like All Together Now, a Zombie Story, and All Right Now, a Zombie Story, also available as audiobooks. I know you like listening to things. If you're listening to this, check that out, narrated by the wonderful David Radke. And then also the Book of David, which is a 5-volume serial horror story. This is in the style of Stephen King. It is violent, it's profane, it's everything you might want if you're tired of middle grade and you want something with a lot of bite. I get real political with some religious satire toward the end. And flying saucers all through. That's an alien on the cover with horns. You can't miss with the Book of David. And I will let you download the Book of David Chapter 1, the first of 5 chapters, for free as an ebook right now, whenever you're watching or listening to this, wherever fine ebooks are sold. So go get your copy. I know you missed us terribly over the 4th of July holiday. Took a couple of weeks off, but we are back with a vengeance because we are doing back-to-back episodes, if you can believe it. Tonight, we're talking to MG Hennessey. Tomorrow, come back about this same time. I'm going to be talking with author Debbie Daddy. I believe it's Debbie Daddy. Debbie Daddy, among other things, is the author of Vampires Don't Wear Polka Dots. You know you've read that book. You love that book. The Baylor School, Baylor School Kids Adventure series is one of the 3 top-selling series through Scholastic of all time. Over 34 million copies sold. You think Debbie Daddy's got some things she could tell us about middle grade fiction and writing successfully? You bet she does. So come back tomorrow night. We'll be chatting with her. Stay tuned. Check out middlegradeninja.com for updates for all future guests. And that's it. I'm out of steam. By God, let's talk to MG Hennessey. MG, how are you tonight?
I'm great. How are you doing, Rob?
I am wonderful. Thank you so much for making the time to be here. I cried just a little bit this afternoon into my mashed potatoes as I was reading the end of the Echo Park Castaways. Without spoiling, it's the best use of an R2-D2 alarm clock on all of literature, as far as I'm concerned. But
that's why I wore my shirt.
A little sensitive. Perfect. So aside from being an absolute Star Wars nut, which absolutely comes through in the Echo Park Castaways, tell esteemed audience a little bit about yourself and your career thus far.
So my name's MG Hennessey, and I'm the author of 2 middle grade books. One is The Other Boy, the first one. I brought props on Rob's recommendation. This just came out in paperback. Very exciting. And this is actually the story of a 12-year-old transgender boy named Shane, who has been living stealth, which means when he moved to Los Angeles from San Francisco, he decided he was just going to go to school as himself. He'd already transitioned. He was assigned female at birth, but he's living as his true self, which is a boy. So none of his friends know, none of his teachers know, his baseball coach doesn't know. And as he gets older, he's kind of trying to toe the line between what's private and what's secret, and whether or not it's safe to tell people. And then he gets outed at school by a bully and has to kind of come back from that. And then Echo Park Castaways is about 4 foster kids who are sharing the same house, and 3 of them have been there for a while. Their foster mom's kind of negligent, to be perfectly honest, but she's it's a safe house. You know, it's one of the better situations most of them have been in. Nevaeh, the oldest girl, has actually cycled through multiple homes. And so they're all pretty keen to stay. And a boy with Asperger's, Quentin, gets assigned to their house and keeps trying to run away, which is really upsetting the balance of the house. You know, the foster mom's already threatened to stop fostering. So they decide, they realize what he wants to do. He's trying to run away to get back to his mother. And so they undertake a quest to help him do that. And so actually the original title of the book was The Epic Quest of the Echo Park Castaways, which I personally loved, but they said it was too long.
It would be difficult to fit on the top of a blog post, just to be perfectly honest. But it is a great title.
It is a great title, right? I was like, I really want it, or you know, my second thing was like, well, what if we just put like an epic quest in parentheses underneath? They didn't go for that either.
Well, that seems like a fair compromise.
Right? I thought so too.
I should have been there. I'd have talked him into it.
I know.
That's a good deal.
Who doesn't love an epic quest? I mean, you know, that's the whole point. They have to kind of have this series of misadventures that by the end of the book kind of brings them together as a found family.
We're going to talk writing, publishing, a little bit of everything, but let's stick with the Echo Park Castaways and Epic Quest. We'll just amend that here. It reminded me quite a bit of Adventures of Babysitting that kept coming into my head a little bit, because there's the older, responsible Nevaeh who's looking after 3 kids on an epic quest. And I don't know how much to say about the story without spoiling, but it is hilarious in parts. It is heartbreaking in parts. Usually one of my first questions for authors is, who is the ideal reader for this story?
You know, I'm really a big believer in, you know, the whole windows and mirrors things, where, you know, I work with foster kids as a court-appointed advocate. So basically, I'm assigned to one kid for their duration of their journey through the system, which is usually around 2 years, give or take. And I just kind of fill in the gaps where the social workers can't do something. Like, you know, they tend to be very overwhelmed. So if, you know, for my last case, I had to help someone find a new school, or if they want to take horseback riding lessons, I see if I can find a place that will donate them for free and find them transportation there and back. So I'm sort of responsible for providing the extras and just being another voice in the hearings to help the kids with, you know, whatever they're, you know, trying to get through, like to be another steady force in their lives. For this book, you know, it was really important to me that a foster kid would see themselves reflected, that the experiences be very real and true to what is actually experienced in the foster care system. But largely, I really want it to be for anyone in this age group, or really anyone older. I mean, I think, there's no reason that adults can't read middle grade fiction. I think some of the absolute best books that I've read in the last 5 years have been middle grade. And I know that when I was growing up, I didn't know anything about, I mean, really, honestly, until I started researching a different book about foster care, I had no idea how broken the system is and how many issues there are in it. And so that was something that I really wanted people to understand, because, it's entirely possible. And we have 30,000 foster kids here in Los Angeles. So if your kids go to school in Los Angeles, it's entirely likely that they are going to school with foster kids and they don't even know it. And that these kids might be going through an incredibly traumatic situation. And kids who are not in foster care have no idea what that's like. So I think it's really important to provide kind of a window into that world and just, make everyone aware of it, because my big belief in why I work in this system is so many of these kids end up homeless or in jail within just a couple of years of getting out of the system. I think that a lot of the problems we have, in a larger sense in society, could actually be fixed if we helped these kids when they're still young. And I think one of the ways to help them is to raise awareness, so that a kid reading this book, grows up knowing like, hey, there's a whole group of people out there who need this kind of help, and maybe they're inspired to help them down the line.
Anybody reading the book, anybody listening or watching to this, you're about to become aware that this is a problem that we all need to take seriously. I went to a small Indiana high school with a graduating class of just under 200, I believe, and we had foster kids throughout.
Yeah.
So, how long have you been working in the foster system?
I've been doing this for I guess this is my 3rd year now, and I also, prior to that, I work in a program called Lifeworks, where I'm a mentor. And I work with mostly people who are transgender or gender expansive. So that was kind of the inspiration for the other boy. And when I was working in that program, a lot of the kids that we get are actually homeless or in the foster care system because they were kicked out of their homes after coming out to their families. So I kind of, became aware of that population and what they were dealing with through that. Like, I learned a lot more about foster care then. And so that kind of morphed into me working on this second book that was a social issues book.
Yeah, unfortunately, there's a lot of that here in the Midwest as well. That's one of those things that never to get too involved in religion or politics, but that's one of those things that when we talk about religion, that should make you suspect right there. Something with the power to turn parents against their children that should be approached with a bit of caution.
Yeah.
So,
no, and I think it's really challenging. I mean, it's a hard problem because, I will say that everyone I know who works in the system, from the lawyers to the social workers to most of the foster parents that I've met, are all wonderful and really devoted to helping these kids. But it's just the volume of it is completely overwhelming, and we just don't have enough foster homes. Like, there aren't enough great foster parents out there. And so, when we're trying to place a kid, I mean, it can be like 100 phone calls to find a spot.
So what can people watching or listening do to help?
There's a lot of things you can do to help, whether it's, if you have the time, I highly recommend becoming a CASA or a GAL. They are, nationwide. I'm sure there's an organization in your area if you're in the United States. And basically you go through a training program and then you get assigned, like I said, to one kid. And, that's what makes it so special is I'm always been a believer that if you can change one life, it'll have a ripple effect, and for me, I know volunteering, having that like one-on-one connection really makes me feel like I'm having more of an impact. Like, I can do more than I could if I was just showing up at a soup kitchen once a month. Not that that's not great too, but, it really doesn't take that much time. And I think that's the thing is, like, if you can't foster kids yourself, volunteer as a CASA. If you don't have the time for that, consider donating one of those donations, because, we're always pressed for cash. And we even have special funds for stuff like what I was saying before. Like, you can donate to a special fund that will help pay for a kid to get horseback riding lessons or piano lessons or something that makes such a huge difference in their lives, that gives them something to hang on to. I mean, in my experience, the kids who really transform are the ones who find that thing that's special to them, you know? And,
What's
you
an
know,
example
unfortunately.
they might find?
So, you know, actually last year there was a kid who his CASA got him into a boxing program at a local gym. They donated sessions for him. And that discipline that he learned there, I mean, he'd been on the verge of dropping out of school. He'd been having all sorts of behavioral problems. And having this outlet to channel that, his frustration and his energy in a positive way, completely turned him around. And he ended up graduating from high school and going to community college and continuing in this boxing program, and also volunteering to help out with the boxing classes for younger kids. So, you know, I mean, that's just, it's a small example, but that's the thing. It doesn't take much, you know, or if you have an organization where you run a camp or have horseback riding classes or boxing, like whatever you do, if there's a way to be like, hey, you know what, maybe I'll see if there's, you know, I'll reach out to the local CASA organization and see if they'd be interested in having me donate some sessions of this, you know, not cash, but just actual time. Like that would be huge.
And that's something you can pretty much do on any budget. And so I wanted to ask
Exactly.
you, you wrote in your afterword, I want to get the wording right, that one of the purposes of writing this book was you wanted to lay bare the inadequacies of the foster care system. So what kind of inadequacies are we talking about? What needs to be made public?
I mean, again, like I think that, you know, as I said, one of the big issues is we just don't have enough foster families. And you know, at least I know here in Los Angeles, we've lost half the foster families over the last 10 years. And partly that's just because there's so much bureaucracy to go through to become a foster parent. You know, you've really got DCFSF heavily involved in your lives to an extent that not everyone's comfortable with. They slashed the financial incentives that people were getting paid. So it became something that was less and less appealing to people. You know, and I think, you know, I don't want to get political, but when we talk about kids getting separated from their parents at the border, a lot of those kids end up in our foster care system here. So we've gotten an average of, you know, I think it's an additional 3,000 or 4,000 kids over the last year. And that's, you know, a huge burden on a system that was already straining under its own weight. So the kid that I'm working with now, it took me 6 months just to get her an eye exam. You know, she needed glasses. It took 6 months. And you know, it feels like every request that we make, like we go in for a hearing, the judge issues a bunch of orders, like, let's get her this and this and this. And it all sounds great. And then you realize like the wait list for all of those things is months long. Like by the time the appointment comes, you've almost completely forgotten that you were going to do it. So, you know, I think that's tough. Like it's just volume. I mean, in Los Angeles, a social worker handles twice as many cases as a New York caseworker. And I think in New York, you know, in all of New York State, they have 20,000 foster kids. We have 30,000 just in LA County.
Wow.
Yeah, it's crazy.
So are some of the things that are being talked about here in the Echo Park Castaways? At one point, Nevaeh recalls a home where you've got an old couple that, I think they're medium-age couple, but they've got sewing machines in the basement, and they put the kids down there, and they've got them working on, what was it, for an online business? Some kind of
Dog beds.
Dog beds, yes. Is
Yeah,
that based on a real, was there a real ancillary event to that?
You know, that's not based on an actual story. There have been stories like that nationally. It's not uncommon that the kids get used as kind of free labor. I think with middle grade fiction, I was kind of towing the line between, you know, there are some much more horrific stories, but that wouldn't be appropriate to include. And I wanted to show just how awful some of these placements can be without going over that line. And I actually have a good friend who grew up in foster care, whose Nevaeh is largely based on. You know, she's an African American woman who spent, you know, 11 years in, I think, 13 homes. And, you know, we've talked a lot about her experiences. So, you know, the truth is that a lot of that stuff happens and it never gets reported.
Well, And I don't want to give listeners or viewers, esteemed audience, the wrong impression. This is a very fun middle grade book. It's age appropriate. It's less than 200 pages. You'll fly right through it. And I think that the only profanity I caught was an ASS. Oh my God!
Yes.
I apologize, gentle listeners, if somebody's fainted or clutched their pearls. Oh my Lord, he spelled a bad word. So it's very much age appropriate. There should be no hesitation in recommending this for any young readers in your life. But it is a very serious subject, and you do a nice job of illustrating the severity of the situation without ever crossing middle grade lines. Was that ever a hindrance to you, not being able to say more interesting and colorful language that would presumably be used by members of this age group, or to be able to further go into details on some of the darker aspects of the system?
I really didn't feel like it was. I mean, it's funny, and you're right. Like, I think, one of the problems with social issues books, I mean, I've got two kids who are, 13 and 14 right now, and getting them to read a social issues book can be really challenging sometimes, because I think there's a misperception that they're like work, that they're not fun. And so, like you said, like, even though what we're talking about right now is very serious about sort of the larger issue, I didn't really, I put that mostly in my afterword, and it's in the book, but I thought it was important for the book to be funny, and I think the characters are very funny, especially Vic. And Quentin cracks me up constantly. And I think it was also really important to me with both of these books, because they do deal with serious subject matter, that they would have a hopeful ending, not an unrealistic ending and not an unearned ending, but a hopeful one, because like I said, with my kids, I know that if the ending isn't at least a little bit happy, they are done. Like, they are not. They hate that. I mean, really, like, they absolutely cannot stand it when that happens. And even in the example that you gave, with the ASS, I mean, it's the funny thing about that is it's not even like being used as a swear word. It's a misunderstanding of Asperger's and and like a kid mishearing it. And that's something that I was always doing as a kid. So I always think it's really funny when kids do that. It didn't really restrict me. I mean, I think a lot of it is that for all that they've gone through, at their heart, these kids, particularly Vic and Mara and Quentin, are very innocent, even for their age. They've got this strange sort of dichotomy where, there's part of them that has seen more than most kids their age, but they also kind of cling to this childhood, and Vic's whole fantasy life about being a super spy and, doing missions and all of that. Like, I feel like that's kind of like a shell for him. It's a safe space that enables him to actually be more childlike than maybe other kids in his grade and situation would be.
That was a fantasy. I was expecting the super secret.
I wanted you to. I wanted people to kind of question it. Yeah, for the first chapter, right? For his first chapter, I wanted people to sort of be like, "Wait a minute, what's happening here?" And I initially started the book on that, and my editor wasn't having it. She thought it was too confusing. I don't know. I mean, I always feel like we don't give kids enough credit. I think that they're much more sophisticated readers than they're sometimes, thought of as being. I mean, my kids read it, read that version of it and had no problem with it right from the start.
And I think it's, spoilers aside, I think it's pretty obvious early on that as much fun as Vic is having, and as much as we want it to be true, that it's probably, we'll read the book, find out, but it's maybe not true. And oh heck, it's very heartbreaking when he comes to the realization that it's not true. So stay tuned. You're gonna laugh, but you're also gonna cry a little bit before the end. So you're gonna feel good. It's very sweet, and the ending is uplifting. So you're gonna have a good time. Let me ask you about writing from three perspectives, because you're writing from Nevaeh's perspective, you're writing from Vic's perspective, which is lots of fun, and then Quentin's perspective, which is extra fun because Quentin just sees the world in a way that very few do. So what was the advantage of writing from those three perspectives rather than a single perspective narrative?
I really wanted to get as close to the points of view of each of these characters as possible. You know, it's a third person book, but it kind of feels like a first person when you're in each character's perspective. And I think it just gives you a larger picture of the story. And I think it also, you know, I mean, the other boy is actually entirely first person. And I think that really worked for that book. For this book, I wanted to show, like, since it is sort of an ensemble piece, I wanted to show how some of the perceptions that they had of each other were the result of misunderstandings or miscommunication. How, you know, one of the reasons that they were all living these kind of separate existences were because they had put up these walls themselves. And so having the chapter shift from one to the other is sort of emblematic of those walls. And I've got some questions about why the youngest character in the book, Mara, doesn't have her own point of view sections, how she's more of, you know, just a participant in the other people's stories. And I got a couple of comments from people who weren't crazy about that. They wanted to see her perspective. I don't know. I mean, I felt like the thing about Mara is she is, in a way, like the conscience of the book, you know, like she sort of embodies like all of this, the best of all of them, you know, and she's also largely the engine that propels a lot of the plot along when you go back and look at the story, even though that's not necessarily apparent while you're reading it. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know. I like challenging myself with writing too. I feel like it's good to kind of, you know, undertake different techniques as you progress as a writer. And so this was one that I really wanted to try.
Yeah, there are some books, I never book shame, so I won't name them, but where you're reading multiple perspectives, like this is just the author, come on. I know this voice, you've been doing it for two other chapters as other characters, but it's all the same. And these are three very, very distinct voices. Did you write them simultaneously, or did you write one character story and then another character story to keep them separate in your mind? How did you write it?
No, you know, honestly, I just wrote it the way that it happened. I mean, it was a linear book for me. So, you know, I literally just, like, originally, you know, I think it starts now with Quentin, but originally it started with Vic. And I literally just cycled like 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, like scene by scene from one character to the next, and kind of what each of them was going through at that point. So yeah, I mean, you know, and I'm also not one of those people who plots. Like, I really didn't know what this story was going to be. I had like a very like overarching idea, you know, that it was going to be sort of like my homage to Stand By Me, which is one of my all-time favorite movies. And I wanted that kind of feeling, you know, that sort of like childhood innocence and, you know, kid, like a book basically that's largely without adults, right? You know, when the adults are present, they're generally sort of interfering with what the kids are trying to do. So I wanted to have that sense as you go through, you know, as you go with them from Echo Park to Torrance, California, which, you know, anyone who lives out here can tell you is not an easy thing to do without a car.
Makes sense to me. And oh, I had a burning question for you, and it's gone right out of my head. That happens. Oh,
I
so
know.
sad.
It'll come back.
Let's talk about Quentin in the meantime, because that was a perspective that really interested me. Not just because that's where we get the bulk of our Star Wars references. In fact, before I ask about Quentin, I have to ask about Star Wars, because it pains me to even think this thought. Star Wars is obviously something that's going to be with us in perpetuity. I imagine now that Disney has their hands on it, we're going to get movies forever, I imagine. Was it ever a concern in referencing so much the original trilogy that might not be the version of Star Wars most familiar to current readers? I don't know if that's a thing. I'm just wondering if the the JJ trilogy would be the one to focus on now, because I'm thinking even. God, it pains me because I remember seeing Phantom Menace in the theater and walking out. And I was the only person, by the way, that wasn't completely devastated. Everyone else was walking out. Like, the acting was bad. Like, it's a Star Wars movie. The acting is bad. It's fine. There was a pod race. They had lightsabers. Still the best lightsaber fight for my money. I'm defending the Phantom Menace. That Darth Maul lightsaber fight worth the price of admission.
It's blasphemy.
I'm sorry.
That's blasphemy.
We're enemies for the rest of the show. That's unfortunate. Do you want to rank your favorite Star Wars movies?
I mean, honestly, Episode 4, A New Hope was that was the first movie I ever saw in a theater that was not animated. It was my first live action movie ever. So that will always hold a very special place in my heart. And, and it's funny. I mean, actually, one of the, when I was researching Quentin's character in particular, I talked to a lot of friends who have children who are autistic, or somewhere along the autism spectrum. My nephew is actually on the autism spectrum. And I also watched a lot of documentaries about autism. And in one of them, there was a boy who was absolutely obsessed with Star Wars. And I think, for him and actually with my kids, in some ways, they have more access because of streaming to these movies than I ever had when I was a kid. I think, we had a video cassette of it that I wore out when I was in 6th or 7th grade. I think we finally got a VCR. But, I'm a dinosaur, I was growing up in that era. So
I watched the original trilogy on beta. So sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, Betamax with the old TV.
Yeah, exactly. So, I think actually for my kids, they have all of them, in the cloud. And so they just watch whichever ones they prefer. And for them, they actually really do prefer the first. They love the first and the second, they love Episode 4 and 5, Empire, even though it doesn't have the happiest ending. They love that one. My kids do not like the middle movies, like the 1, 2, and 3. They do not like those movies at all. And they've been thrilled with the latest ones just because Rey is such a great character, and having a girl really propel it forward, I think, has been huge for them. So I don't know. I worried about it a little bit, but I also felt like when I was writing this, actually for both books, my kids were right in that strike zone, when they were that age. So it means that I know how these kids talk. I know what a lot of their pop culture stuff is. My kids actually went through a whole summer where they were obsessed with I Love Lucy. And they watched every episode of I Love Lucy, I think 3 times. They just kept going back through the seasons over and over again. So it's just kind of hilarious because they have access to things that you would think they would find super dated, but they love them. So yeah, I wasn't as concerned about that part.
I agree. And for those members of esteemed audience who are eternally curious, Empire is also my favorite Star Wars movie. So there you go. Although
you've redeemed yourself.
Well, I'm gonna unredeem myself because I genuinely enjoy Revenge of the Sith. The prequel trilogy is it's hit and miss. It's better than not a Star Wars movie for the most of it, but a few bone-inducing moments in that third film when Obi-Wan and Anakin Skywalker, I almost forgot, have that lava fight. Ooh,
oh my God, the lava fight! Oh no!
Nope. We're just gonna have to agree to disagree on that, I suppose. So let's talk about autism.
One note on that though. So here's the one thing that really bothered me about that is apparently they still had that speed of light technology for their ships at that point, but they didn't have ultrasound, so they had no idea she was having twins. I felt
I like how they tried to sneak in an internet-like capability in the new series. They're like, the ships are all connected, of course.
Yeah,
we totally foresaw that. People like living in these big, bulky rooms. Nobody brought a beanbag chair or something. No!
Exactly.
Let's talk a little bit about autism, just because it's, I would think, a very challenging thing to write from the perspective of an autistic character. So how did you get in Quentin's head? What tips can you give esteemed audience about writing from an autistic perspective?
Yeah, that was really challenging for me. And actually, we did have a lot of sensitivity readers for this book, and I really appreciated. One of them was the parent of an autistic child, who I really appreciated their viewpoint. And by and large, actually, they really enjoyed the voice. There were a couple of things that they wanted me to tweak, which I did end up tweaking. I had a few too many personality tics and obsessions initially in the earlier drafts of the book. I didn't want him to be Rain Man. I didn't want it to sound too much like Curious Incident of the Dog in the Night. And I think that's true. And I also didn't want to make it comical. I wanted Quentin to be like, he has a very different perspective on the world than the other kids, but I didn't want to make him laughable. That was really important to me. That was a line that I didn't want to cross. And since he is really basically almost completely non-communicative with the kids, he has very little dialogue over the course of the book. So much of it is his internal monologue, which is really the way that you're seeing the world through his eyes is vastly different. And I'm hoping that I got it right. I mean, again, it's challenging because I don't have Asperger's. I'm not on the autism spectrum, and my experience of this will always be secondhand. But hopefully I came close to getting it, true. And most of the people I know who have read it, who, some of whom are on the spectrum, have actually written very nice letters about it. So, that was the other thing, is I wanted this character to be portrayed as someone who was actually in a lot of ways almost more capable than the other kids at some things. He has a skill set, each of the kids brings their own unique talents to the story. Without all of them working together, they would never have made it. So that's part of what I wanted to show.
Makes sense, though. They complement each other nicely, and I'm tempted to say that Quentin's the heart of the story, but that's not really true, because they're all the heart of the story. They've all got an emotional arc before the end.
He's the glue. I think that's the thing, is he ends up becoming the glue of the story.
And he cracked me up when he just started thinking of Vic as loud boy and Mara as quiet girl. That sounds about right for that perspective. Let's see. While we're talking about Echo Park, I did want to ask you, how long did this book take to write, and how many drafts did you have to do to get it to where it was publishable and ready to go?
Oof. That's a good question. This book went through, it's funny because the other boy was quick. I feel like the other boy I probably wrote in a month and a half, maybe. I mean, it just kind of poured out of me. Echo Park, the first draft was more of a struggle, for sure. The ending in particular, one of the problems with writing without an outline is that getting to that ending, especially since I had to get them to a specific location, was challenging. I had to really figure that out in a way that would also be kind of scary and thrilling, but not too scary and thrilling, and not, something that would surprise the audience. And so that was hard. It was hard to get there. I feel like that might have taken me 5 or 6 months to finish, maybe. And then it went through a lot of revision, and a lot of that was, sensitivity reader feedback, because, it was really important to me that each of these characters really represent the demographics that we have here in Los Angeles, since that's where the book's set. So, there's an African-American girl, there's 2 Latinx kids, there's Quentin with Asperger's. And so, we needed to have sensitivity readers for all of those things. And so that ended up resulting in a lot more changes, which was good. I think it was really helpful for me to have that input, because, I wanted to make sure that I was true to all those populations. Oh, and I wanted to just say, just as an aside, when we're talking not about the book, but about the real world, one of the things that I say in my afterword, which I think is really important to address, is that the reason that we have so many people of color disproportionately represented in the foster care system is not because those kids are more likely to be abused or neglected. It's because they're more likely to be taken out of the home. There is just a institutionalized racism in the judicial system where, for whatever reason, that is what happens, and I kind of a classic example. I have a friend who had a 3-year-old, and she was, at home with the flu with the 3-year-old, and the mom was like on the couch, like completely out of it, just feeling like she was dying, and realized that there was a breeze in the living room, and she hadn't seen the 3-year-old in a while. Like, she kind of dozed off, opened her eyes, felt a breeze, went out, and this was the day that the 3-year-old had figured out how to open the front door. And she ran, she went frantically, like running through the neighborhood in like her pajamas and her slippers, and 3 blocks away from their house by a really busy street, she sees a police car and a woman and her 3-year-old sitting on the curb. And she races up to them and is just hysterical and explaining the situation. And, the cop ended up saying like, oh, of course, we completely understand these things happen. And, she took her child home, and she, we were talking about it afterwards, and she's like, all I could think about on the way home, because she also works as a CASA, is that if I was a person of color, there's a good chance I would not have been taking my child home with me that night, because it would have been assumed that, I wasn't a fit parent. But instead, I just basically got a little like pat on the head and be more careful next time, and maybe put in a childproof lock. So that's just something I want to make clear, because, I don't want anyone to misconstrue why the characters are the races that they are.
Oh, hadn't even occurred to me, but that makes sense.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, I've talked about this before. I grew up in an mostly all white small Indiana town, and everybody on TV was white in the '80s mostly, except for the Cosby, the good wholesome Cosby family. There was surely never any trouble there. And then I went to school and fell in love with an African American woman, and we got married, and it was just like stepping into or out of the matrix, and suddenly you can see, institutionalized racism is everywhere. I didn't have to pay attention to this, but there it is, and there it is again. You almost get sick of it. What's the answer to the riddle? It's racism again. Of course it is.
Yeah. No, it's very true.
So we'll let's pivot to something
more cheerful.
Not that, yeah.
Sorry.
Let's talk about the other boy.
Okay.
So that you said you wrote that, and you said a month and a half. Did I hear that right?
I think so. Yeah, it was really fast. That was one of my faster books. And I really, that one just, that was a very personal story for me. It was based largely again, like on like kids that I know and have worked with. And so it was just source material that I knew really, really well. And I don't know, in some ways it was an easier story. It's a little more compact, and it's about, and a lot of it too is not just about, this kid's experiences as a transgender boy. Like, a lot of it is about, the fact that he's also, a child with divorced parents and kind of having to juggle that. And he's got his first crush, and he's trying to figure out how to navigate that. And he and his best friend are having issues for the first time in their relationship. And, and he's also got like the weight on his shoulders of the baseball championship, and he's the star pitcher, and it's sort of all on him to help them win the big game. So in that way, like, I wanted to make him really relatable, because he's going through a lot of things that kids his age who are not transgender are going through.
So, well, let's stick with the boring stuff, and we'll talk a little bit more about the story. But just plain boring stuff that's really only interesting to the sort of folks that would tune into a show like this about writing. How many drafts after that initial month and a half burst are you looking for, and how long was the process to find a publisher or an agent and all of that?
It was pretty quick, actually. I honestly, like, we went to auction with this book probably, it was, I don't know, maybe I'd done 1 or 2 revisions at that point. When I write, I'm a big believer in just writing it all at once without looking back at all. I do not edit at all if I write. And it's the one piece of advice that I offer to aspiring writers or people who are trying to finish their first book, because I know so many people who got like 50 pages into a novel And then we're like, hey, you know, this is great. Like, I'm making progress. Like, let's moving along. Like, let's see what I've got so far. And the truth is that editing is a much, much slower process than writing for most people. I know it is for me. I mean, it probably takes me 4 times as long to edit a page as it does to write it in the first place. I can spend an entire day on, you know, a chapter or a scene or even a page. So by the time that they've gotten back up to that 50-page mark and they've edited it, I feel like it's suddenly like writing the rest of the book starts to feel really insurmountable most of the times. Like, I don't know if you've ever read Bill Bryson. He's like a really funny travel writer who has this book called A Walk in the Woods about trying to undertake the Appalachian Trail, you know, which goes from like, I think it's like Georgia to Maine, right? And he and this kind of hilarious buddy of his decide they're going to hike the Appalachian Trail, even though they're sort of out of shape, middle-aged white guys. And so they start hiking, and like, you know, and the thing is, like, the beginning of the book is a disaster. Like, they're totally unprepared. Like, the friend only brought like a backpack full of like Little Debbie's snack cakes. You know what I mean? They're like, they're horribly out of shape. They really overpacked. And then, like, you know, like a couple chapters in, they're like, I don't know, and like they're making progress. Like, they really feel like, okay, we got this now. We know where to go, how to camp. Like, we've got our winnowed down our supplies. We've got only the stuff we need. And so they stop at this general store off the trail that has a big map of the trail. And they're like, hey, like, let's see where we are. Like, this is great. We're really been making progress like these last few weeks. And they realize that like the Appalachian Trail's like this, and they're like here. Like, they're still like, they've barely even registered on the map of the trail yet. And it's this incredibly frustrating thing. And I feel like for a lot of writers who stop and start editing at that 50-page point, that's how they feel, right? Like, they're here on the trail and it starts to feel like, oh my God, like, I'm never going to get there. So for me,
that makes sense.
Yeah. So for me, I mean, I write the entire book. I mean, I don't even look back. I've got like typos. It's just a hot mess. Like, I just burn through it as fast as I can, because especially since I don't plot it out in advance, I really just need to get the bones of the story in place, at least a version of them, and then see if it works and see what I've got. And then I go back through, and it's like painstaking. I mean, I honestly can't say. On average, I probably do 15 or 20 revisions of each book, but some of that's like, you know, I'll revise one chapter 20 times. And some chapters end up more or less staying the same from the first time that I sat down to write them all the way through to publication. So it just kind of varies, you know? I mean, and I also believe, like I always tell people, I mean, this is what works for me. It might not work for another person. Like, I always get really irritated when writers' advice is like, you have to write every day. And I'm like, that is nonsense. I don't know anyone who writes every day. I mean, I know people who say they write every day. There is no way that every single person who says that is writing every day. Like, you know, I'm a mom and I have a life, and there are like weeks sometimes where I can't write, but that doesn't mean that I'm not a writer, you know? And I also know people who spend 15 years finishing one book, and people who write 3 books a year, you know, and they're all writers who are just doing it in a different way. So I think that's the challenge, is just figuring out what your own particular path is.
So what does your typical writing day look like?
My typical day is like, I drop my kids at school. I usually try to exercise or take the dog for a hike, which accomplishes 2 things in one fell swoop.
Sure.
And then around like 10 o'clock, 10:30 maybe, I like really sit down to it. I mean, my goal is to get 2 or 3 hours a day. You know, especially if I'm just in the writing phase, like I just burn out after that. I feel like I get less and less productive the longer that I try and write. I mean, people who can do a 12-hour writing jag, I bow down to them. I can't do that. I can edit that way, but when I'm actually writing the book the first time through, I can't do that. And so, yeah, I do that for a couple of hours, and, you know, and then like deal with emails or marketing or whatever else I have to do. And then, you know, the kids are home from school and we're making dinner and running around to all the various activities. And, you know, that's kind of my day. So, I know there are people who get up at 5 a.m. to write. God help me if I had to be one of those writers. I would never have written a book. Like, I don't know. I'm like my friend who gets up to exercise at that hour. I'm like, what is wrong with you? Like, oh my God, no.
I used to be one of those writers before my son was born, but ever since then, for the last 5 years, if I get up early, there's no point because he gets up early. So I'm like,
Exactly.
all right, 4:30, time to write. Nope, baby's up.
Yeah.
Now I'm just tired. I could have slept and wrote later.
Exactly. Get the sleep. I feel like, especially as a parent, like, get the sleep, and find the windows that you can. And, and there was a time when I was traveling like a lot, and I would just figure out, I would write in airports. Like, I feel like, even if you only manage to write a page a day, by the end of the year, you've got a book, right? So, maybe 1 week I might write, 25 pages or 30 pages. Maybe the next week I only get 2. But, sooner or later the book gets done. I think on average a book takes me about 3 months usually. That's probably and that's like taking some time. Oh, and the other thing that I do is I don't look things up. Like, if I need to figure out like, oh, I need a specific place, or in this book, a lot of it was like buses and train lines, right? Trying to map out the exact journey these kids would take. And of course, after I published it, like, they changed all of those routes and numbers. I was like, like, this is ridiculous. But yeah, I try and get
Los Angeles Metro System, help us out.
Exactly. So if I need to look something up, or I need to like name a character and I don't have the name off the top of my head, I put in like brackets. It's something that someone like said once at a conference, and it really stuck with me because brackets don't occur naturally in any other writing scenario. So at the end of the book, when I'm done, I go back through and I fill in the brackets, and that's when I do my deep dive down the rabbit hole of internet searches.
Well, that's smart. I do the same thing. I just I make up a word, put it in bold, get back to it. And I'll do that sometimes even with characters. If I'm, I've spent a lot of time on my main characters, but if I've got just an ancillary character that I don't know that's going to be in more than 1 or 2 chapters yet, I'll just name them. I don't have time to come up with a good name for them, so I'll give them like a movie star's name and just put that in bold. Like, find a better name. When you figure out how much they're going to be in the story and how much we care about them, then go back and really invest and flesh them out if needed, or maybe cut them completely.
Right.
And then was the other boy your first book that you'd written, or had you written books prior to that to develop your craft?
I actually have other books under other names. I'm one of those writers who has, a series of pen names. And so I, kind of going back to that like privacy versus secrecy thing, like I try to keep a bit of a wall between those different personalities. So, I've actually written 12 books, and I've written 15 books. I've published 12 books. So I have some other very different novels out there. But these are the only ones that I have for this age group. And so I wanted to, especially since the other books would really not be appropriate for kids, I wanted to have a very clear delineation between these and those.
I should do that, but I just assume putting the super secret pen name Robert Kent keeps him out. Nope, that's airtight. They'll never
figure it out.
So did you already have an agent in place then when you'd written the other boys?
I did, and that made it a lot easier. And I think that, this is actually my third agent. I had my first agent retired on me. My second agent, there were some issues. I actually got fired by an editor because they disliked dealing with that agent so much that I found out afterwards the reason my contract had not been renewed was because they loathed this agent. So I switched, and I've been with the same agent now for about 10 years, and she's wonderful, and I'm really happy with her. I feel like, the process of getting an agent is very different now than it was when I actually was in the era where you had to mail the first 25 pages of your manuscript with a query letter. I had to go to the post. It's crazy, like dark ages.
Oh no, I've stood in the
But
post office with a stack of envelopes and dreaded
yeah.
getting in the mailbox 2 or 3 weeks later, and there's 5 of myself address stamped envelopes. I'm like, oh, that can't be good. Those came back too soon.
Right. No, so I've been really lucky with my agent, but I've also learned, I think, by having gone through a couple of agents that my advice in general for people who are looking for an agent, I think conferences are the best place to find them. I think if there's any way you can get to a conference where there are agents who are like taking on clients, that's great. I also feel like you want to go down a rung in the agency. Like I would not necessarily go for, the biggest agent, or the most famous one. I feel like it's good to go down a couple of rungs, especially going to someone younger, because your agent is going to be with you hopefully for your whole career, and you want someone who's still kind of young and hungry. I feel like I did make that mistake with my first agent because she retired on me. She was wonderful. She had her own agency, but 2 years in, she decided she wanted to spend more time with her grandchildren, which I completely respected, but it meant that I was kind of out of luck, because that's my other piece of advice is don't go to a one-person shop or even a 2 or 3 person shop. I like an agency that's mid-sized, particularly if they have a legal department, because I know that there's sort of this assumption that all contracts are boilerplate, but they're not. And there are things that I've gotten in later contracts and things that the legal departments at my agency have caught that none of my other agents ever even noticed. And things that are important, like cover approval, title approval, like things that make a big difference. So I would say that's what I'm like. I feel like that's where I didn't do enough research at the beginning. Like I was just so excited to get an agent, and have anybody who wanted to represent me, that I was just like, I leapt at the first person who responded. And I wish that I had taken more time at the beginning, because I think it would have really helped me in the end.
Oh, but it's hard when you've been querying and writing for God knows how long, and somebody says, "I like you. You're special."
Exactly.
That's all the qualification
No,
I need. Like,
I
would you
know.
like to check some of my previous clients and verify me? No, you like me. It's great.
Well, and that's the other thing is I actually have friends who, I have one friend who it turns out her agent was stealing from her. And, again, it was like a one-person shop, and the agent basically just stopped responding to her at one point. And then later she found out that there was like a lot of, when she actually started really going through her royalty contracts, that there was like a lot of money missing. So there are a lot of those stories out there. And I'm probably going to get a lot of angry emails from like one-person agencies now. I'm sure there were some good ones. I'm sure there are some good ones.
MG Hennessey's views do not reflect the views of the show. Middle Grade Ninja is impartial. We're happy to chat with any literary agents who are available. Come on, tell us about your one-person agency shop and why it's the best possible thing. That'll be a great conversation. No, I always put that caveat, whether you're listening to an episode of the show, whether you're at the blog where there's hundreds of literary agent interviews available right now at middlegradeninja.com. I don't do that much research beyond verifying that they're not an obvious scam artist. And in the cases, there have been a couple where it comes back that the agent has been found misbehaving. In fact, one agent got blown up for stealing royalties. And all I do in that case is I put a note on the top of the blog with a link to that verified. Do your homework beyond me. I can't do all that homework for you.
Yeah.
I have a child. I have my own books to write. I've got this podcast. I've got plenty on my plate. So you need to do your research, and you need to go to more than one location. But I don't take those interviews down. I just put a note there. So nothing's been substantiated. I've just heard rumors. I don't even do that because I think the interviews with bad literary agents also have a lot to teach us. So I love having those posted.
Well, and I think the other thing too, though, is that, that's like, like the conferences. Like, I feel like the best way to get that information is to talk to other authors about who their agents are and what they like about them. That's invaluable.
Since you've got a good literary agent, are you comfortable telling us who you're represented by?
Yes, I'm with Steph Roston at Levine, Greenberg, and Roston. And she's been really wonderful. And, you know, she's got like much more high profile clientele than me. Like, unfortunately, I don't know that she's actually taking anyone anymore. I sort of like slid in the door, like right as she was closing the gates. But yeah, she's been amazing. And I think, you know, I think that's a lot of it too, is a lot of it with an agent is you have to have a relationship with them. Like, you know, I consider her a friend. Like we, you know, can go out to dinner and talk for 3 hours about, you know, completely subjects that have nothing to do with writing or books. So I think that's important too. That's something to factor in.
And then, can you give us some juicy details? Because I know this is what the audience craves about the second agent who we won't name. What sort of behavior were they up to that was upsetting your publisher that they didn't want to renew your contract?
So what happened was I ended up finding out afterwards. This is when I signed again, like with sort of a storied older agent. But it turned out that the person who actually was representing me and doing most of the communication with the publishers was his kind of mentee who he had just taken into the company. And this was, again, like a one-person shop who, you know, I think this kid was like the assistant who was answering the phones and then sort of stepped in and was doing most of the day-to-day work, which I was not aware of when I signed with them. So this was when the show Entourage was super popular. Do you remember that show?
Oh, of course.
It was based on like Ari Emanuel, who's a big talent agent here in Los Angeles, who is like notorious for his temper and for, you know, kind of the borderline abusive way that he treats underlings and people in negotiations. So I feel like the kid, you know, because he was a kid who was doing the day-to-day work, really emulated that character. And so my understanding is that when he would get on the phone with the publisher, like it was this very aggressive kind of like, you know, persona that he had adopted that was very off-putting. Let's put it that way. So that's my understanding, is that like, there was a lot of sort of, you know, he would pick up the phone and be like, you know, hey, like, you know, my client told you that they don't like this cover. Like, what are you going to do about it? And, you know,
with expletives, I'm sure trailed in between.
Sure. I mean, it was like, I don't, you know, and unfortunately, like I had no idea that any of that was going on. I mean, really, like I had no idea. So it was only really well afterwards when I ran into that editor at a conference that the story came out, and, you know, that was really upsetting. So, you know, at that point I jumped ship, but yeah, it's tough. You just, you know, you need to have that trust. I think that's the thing, is I know that my agent now would never do that.
But you survived it. Your career is flourishing. Yeah, here you are on the Middle Grade Ninja show. My God.
You know, it did, like but it did end a relationship with a regular publisher, you know? So I ended up going to a different publishing house after that. And that was, you know, I mean, I think that's the thing, is that a lot of it as an author is building those relationships, you know, and it's great if you can have one editor be your champion for the bulk of your career. Like, I feel like that's something that we don't get as much anymore. That's sort of like the old school, you know, you'd sit in like with like a cigar and a brandy in a study with your editor and have like conversations, and they would be your friend. They'd be like sort of your Ezra Pound, right? Like, we don't really get that anymore. You know, there's so much more movement and transition, and a lot of times the editors are super young now, you know, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. Again, oh my gosh, here we go.
We got a special cameo appearance.
We have Mr. Slippers is paying a visit.
Welcome to the show, Mr. Slippers. We've enjoyed your appearance.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. Yeah. He managed to actually open the door. It's hilarious. The animals are getting.
When I did my episode with Susan K. Quinn, my cat busted out and it had a little bell on her collar, so you can hear this little bell jingling. And then at one point, she crawled across here and fell into a trash can. So it's just like, is that something you need to attend to? No, the cat's already run off.
Yeah. Hello. Very insistent on getting some attention.
Well, I know we're coming up near the end of our time. It always flies by so fast. It's so nice to have a conversation with somebody about writing, and nobody's allowed to look at their cell phone. It's great. So I have to ask, because esteemed readers come after me when I don't, or esteemed audience comes after me when I don't. MG Hennessey, Have you seen a flying saucer, and do you believe in them?
I absolutely believe in them. I mean, you've seen all of those like Navy reports, right? Like all the stuff that's come out lately where they finally had to kind of acknowledge that they do have a division that's looking into it.
Yeah, I need to start asking this question: is why don't you believe in flying saucers? But continue.
I mean, the universe is huge. I mean, of course, there's intelligent life out there somewhere else. And they're probably much more intelligent than we are. Like, I have no doubt about that. I've never seen one. But then again, I have almost always lived in places where there is so much light pollution that I feel like I wouldn't see one unless it actually landed on my doorstep.
Yeah, and then you've got bigger problems.
Yeah, or brand new friends. I don't know. I mean, could it be worse at this point?
Well, without getting too political, that's one little pet theory I have. Because I keep hearing this argument that I heard Steven Spielberg make the argument in Close Encounters, the umpteenth release, that he was losing heart because he would think that in the communication age, with everybody walking around with camera phones, there'd be more video of them. And she's like, dude, have you been on YouTube? That's all there is videos of flying saucers.
Is that true?
It's that and cat videos. So my suspicion is that now that we are in the information age and communication is moving so much faster, that we are seeing pretty much just short of disclosure at this point with everything that's come out. And I kind of think that if we get impeachment proceedings started, they're going to dump this on Trump, make him the disclosure. He's going out anyway.
I actually believe that like they don't want us to see them. Like, because they're like, we are not going anywhere near that hot mess. Like,
well, that's understandable.
Right? Like, that's my feeling is like, if they're advanced enough to like shoot across the galaxy, then they're probably advanced enough to like hide that fact from us. So, yeah.
I would. I'd approach with extreme caution.
Yeah.
So, okay, well, let's go back to talking about writing, because that's important. I'm going to ask you 2 more questions, and we'll call it a night. Because I know you've got eager cats that are waiting for you.
Like staging a jailbreak.
What's your favorite reader reaction to something you've written?
I got a really lovely letter from a trans boy after The Other Boy came out, handwritten, which doesn't happen very often. And that's something I also want to say, especially for like middle grade readers, is a lot of people don't realize that if you loved a book or you have a question about a book, most authors are really accessible online. Like you can email them or hit them up on Instagram or Twitter, or, I feel like we're all on every single platform now because the publishers want us to be. But reach out and ask them, be like, tell them you like their book. I mean, we're all desperate to hear that. Like, it's really always wonderful to hear. But I got this letter from a trans boy who had not come out to his family yet and was terrified to. And reading the book actually gave him the courage to come out to his parents. And because of that, he had finally started his transition. And that one for me was really special because he felt like, in reading the book, he really identified with Shane. And he felt like seeing Shane's courage in the book kind of helped give him courage. So for me, that was like a really remarkable letter to get, and something that, I'm always going to treasure.
Well, yeah. Who else would you write a book like that for, if not for that person in that situation? Well, that's spectacular. I'm glad that happened. I'd also add the caveat that if you're going to take the time to write a nice letter about how much you love a book, especially if it's email, copy and paste that. Post it on Goodreads. Post it on Amazon. Put 5 stars.
Very true. Very true.
Take the extra moment. And then my next question for you, because we just don't have the time to discuss craft as deeply as I'd like. So just my catch-all question is, if there was one piece of advice somebody could have given to you when you started writing that would have made a significant difference in your writing career, what would that piece of advice have been?
Oh, I feel like I did get that advice, which was know when to walk away from a book. Because my first novel, which I spent years on and off, and which actually started as like a series of short stories. That was the one that I did the mass mailing, like 50 agents, and got, 50 rejections, ranging from like form letters to polite no thank yous. And I really tried for, and some people would be like, hey, maybe if you rewrite this, maybe if you write that. And so I spent a lot of time constantly revising that book. I mean, I sort of joked that that book was my master's in writing class because, I just kept at it and kept at it. And I had a friend finally who was a fairly well-known author. He sat me down one night and said, time to move on. Like, you know what? Maybe someday that book, you go back to that book with fresh eyes. And that's, and that's the other thing is like, I always advocate putting a book away after you finish the first draft. Lock it up if you can for 2 to 4 weeks. Don't look at it at all. And then when you go back to it, you really do see it with fresh eyes. But this I had done over and over with that book. And they were like, enough. Either you're, if you're a writer, you have more than one book in you. And I believe that you have more than one book in you and you need to like explore that. And so I sat down the next night, really disheartened and really not excited to start another book. And I had the idea for an opening scene and decided to just see where it would take me. And, then looked up and I'd written 10 pages. And that was the book that got me an agent. And that was the first thing that I got published. So I think that's the thing is I think, persistence is important. Everyone always says persistence when I'm on a panel and this questions gets asked. But I also feel like, there's time to do a little bit of a reality check and know that, I feel like it's, it wasn't Joyce Carol Oates. It was, who wrote To Die For? I'm blanking on her name right now. Gosh, she's such a great writer. But anyway, she actually talked about how she, or Michael Chabon, like the classic stories, like The Adventures of Cavalier and Clay, which he ended up getting the Pulitzer for. He wrote The Wonder Boys when he was struggling so much with Cavalier and Clay, like the manuscript in The Wonder Boys. I don't know if you've read it or seen the movie.
Oh, God, yes, and gone to see Mr. Chabon speak, and he gave me a big hug, and we took our picture together. It was one of the happiest moments of my life. Mr. Chabon, please come on the show. Continue.
Yeah. So that's one of the jokes is like, that's the manuscript in the movie and in the book, right? It's like, that's supposed to be like Cavalier and Clay. And to give himself a break from it, he wrote The Wonder Boys, like kind of on a tear, it's just sort of like a fun, like distraction. And then when he went back, he was able to finish Cavalier and Clay. So that's what the thing is, I feel like, it's sort of like the know when to walk away, know when to run, right? Like listen to Kenny Rogers. Sometimes you got to walk away.
That's the writing advice that we want people to take away. Kenny Rogers, don't miss out.
Know when to fold them.
Sneaky follow-up question. Have you ever revisited that novel that you walked away from?
Yes, and it's terrible. It's terrible. I mean, really, like, honestly, I actually reread it and was like, it was so generous of the people who did submit feedback to do that because it is ghastly. Like, it's just, I think it was, very much a product of who I was at that time. And it was like largely, it was sort of semi-autobiographical. And yeah, it was just a really bad book, honestly. Like, it is unsalvageable. I have other books. I have 2 other books sitting in a drawer that I think could be salvaged at some point, but I don't know if I'm up for going back to them. I'm always one of those people who kind of goes forward. It's tough for me to go back. Like, I don't reread books. Aside from Star Wars, I don't generally rewatch movies. I'm just like, I'm all about the new.
I think Stephen King said that his old books he's like a snake, and those are the skins that he shed, and he's moving on to the next one.
And I believe that too. Like, I like to think that you improve with every book, that you learn something with every book, kind of like with relationships, like you take something away with them. But, even looking back like that, even that first book I got published, I look back now and I would change a lot of things in it if I could. I feel like I'm a better writer now than I was when I wrote that book.
Which is good. Wouldn't it be terrible if it was the other way around?
It would indeed be terrible if it was the other way around.
Well, MG Hennessey, this has been a blast. We laughed, we had fun, we talked about all manner of things. What a wonderful episode for a esteemed reader our esteemed audience to find. Thank you very much for making the time to do this. Where can esteemed audience find you online? Where can they stalk you?
Well, all of the ways to find me online are on my website, mghennessey.com. Mind you, it's Hennessey EY, not just Y, like the drink. And yeah, I'm on Instagram. I mean, pretty easy to find. I'm on Instagram. I'm on Twitter. To be honest, I'll give the caveat that I'm not extremely active on any of those sites, just because I do feel like social media becomes more of a distraction for me than it's worth. Like I've made a big effort to kind of step back from it to some extent over the last couple of months. I'm really only on Instagram to keep track of my kids. So, but I will respond. I will respond if you reach out to me there.
Every time I get a new Twitter follower, I just feel pity for them. I look forward to my 5 tweets a week.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's see. Esteemed audience, as always, make sure you head to middlegradeninja.com, check out all the reviews there, keep up with what's going on with the show. Make sure you come back about the same time tomorrow when we're talking with Debbie Daddy. That's going to be amazing. Do not forget, it's an easy contest to enter. Look at this. Quality book, something like Gravity and the Echo Park Castaways. You're going to get brand new, never read, barely touched. I'm trying not to smudge the covers as I hold them up here. Barely touched books, plus one of mine, your choice, any of my books that you want signed. I'll even make it out to eBay if you want. And all you have to do is between now and August 15th, subscribe to my channel, Rob Kent, at YouTube. Just do a search for Middle Grade Ninja. And why wouldn't you want to subscribe? Look how much great content we got out of just this one episode. And brother, there are 28 other episodes. Every bit is packed with amazing content. So make sure you check that out and more on the way. MG, I've been asking our guests to sign us off. And our sign-off phrase is hiya and what have you. Will you sign us off?
Hiya and what have you.